This is Comic Shenanigans, episode 1039, a conversation with Pat Olliffe and Tom DeFalco.
Ain't no stopping them shenanigans. Love getting into shenanigans. All up in them shenanigans. 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 Shenanigans.
Welcome to the Comic Shenanigans podcast. I'm your host, Adam Chapman. This is episode 1039. It's a conversation with Pat Olliffe and Tom DeFalco. I was very excited to have both Pat and Tom back on the show. Pat has more recently been on a few episodes of Comic Shenanigans, talking about, actually the last one he was on, actually with someone else, with Chuck Austin, as we were talking about their most recent creator-owned book, The Tormented, through Comixology Originals. But I had asked Pat if he could come back and do a bit more of a deep dive into his work on the recent miniseries, which is quite a mouthful. It's Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars Battleworld. Wait, Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars Battleworld. That is correct. It took me a second to even think about it. I was very excited to have him back on. I talked to him right before the first issue came out. I had an advanced copy of the first issue, and we were chatting about that on a previous episode that Pat had been on. And so I definitely wanted to kind of do more of a deep dive into his work on the series, because I really enjoyed his overall work on it. I thought it was a really fun, fast-moving, action-packed, hoo-ha action Marvel book in the grand Marvel tradition, and something I really enjoyed. And then he actually came back and said, "Hey, what about getting Tom DeFalco to join?" And I'm like, "Well, I'm always up for chatting with Tom." So it was an absolute pleasure to be able to have them both on together. We kind of go back and forth between I pepper Tom with questions, I pepper Pat with questions, but overall it was a very enjoyable conversation, which is always the case when I'm speaking with these two gentlemen, and I hope you really enjoy it as well. And if you've read this particular 4-issue miniseries, obviously I think you'll get a lot more out of this, because I do think it was just it's nice to do any type of creator commentary. That's something I really enjoyed doing, is being able to kind of go do these deep dives, and this was one of those opportunities I got to do. This was actually the fourth appearance for Tom. He was previously, if you want to go back, you could check out episode 256. He was one of the first creator interviews I actually ever did. I did Nick Batara, I think, in the hundreds of my episodes, and then around 250 or so is when I started what I jokingly called, I think it was the winter interview season or the spring interview season, and it was just something I really enjoyed doing, and I kept getting people to come back and say yes to coming back, so I just kind of never stopped. And then he was on a few years later, so that was back from March 2015. He came back 3.5 years later for a September 2018 episode, episode 614, which was a lot of fun. And then his next appearance would have been episode 748 back in February 2020. He actually joined a creator commentary on A-Next, which is anyone who's listened to the show hopefully understands how much A-Next really means to me. And I had done the first 6 issues doing a full deep dive with Ron Friends, extremely good friend of the show. And so, that was kind of a similar idea to what Pat had done here, where Ron was like, well, do you want to see if DeFalco will come on? And he acquiesced and came back, and we chatted about A-Next 7 to 12. So that would have been episode 748 from February 2020. So again, this is his 4th episode. When we're talking about Pat, however, he's been on a number more, although as I just said, he's been in a lot just in the last few months. So he has previously appeared in episodes 278, 450, 810, 850, 1016, and 1033. So, I don't think he's quite up to Ron Friends levels yet, but he's getting closer. So anyways, I apologize for prattling on, but again, I really dug this conversation. It was a lot of fun, and I hope that you will enjoy this very much as I did. Now, in terms of upcoming episodes, this is always exciting. Ron Friends, the aforementioned Ron Friends, will be hopefully rejoining the podcast extremely soon in the next couple of weeks. The to talk about a smattering of different books, actually. I kind of put it out to him. I'm like, well, is there any particular, work of yours that you really want to kind of do a deep dive into or talk about that doesn't usually get talked about? And Ron, the consummate professional, was always like, you know what, you let me know you want, pick a project, and I'll refresh my memory, and we'll do it. And I thought that was great. So I actually picked out a few particular issues. I had picked out Amazing Spider-Man 255, Amazing Spider-Man 265, so it was the first appearance of both Black Fox and Silver Sable, Untold Tales of Spider-Man 9 and 25, and Hercules Heart of Chaos 1 to 3. So I'm excited to chat about those. The interview hasn't obviously happened yet, but hopefully it's going to be happening very soon. Ariana Marr, who's a letterer with virtual calligraphy, doing a lot of Marvel work, is actually going to be coming on to break down how she did the lettering and kind of set up the templates that would assist her with a run on Superman, which is the most recent relaunch of the Superman title. So that'll be coming up soon as well. Mark Russell is going to be coming on soon to talk about a variety of different projects. We have a new Book of the Month Club episode coming out at the end of May, which will continue our look into the Clone Saga, and then we'll take a month off from that. Actually, at the end of June, we're going to be doing one that's more on Alpha Flight appearances for Canada Day, since I always release these on the last Saturday of every month. That's when we'll be doing for that particular month, and then we'll just kind of go back to the Clone Saga after 1 month off. So we don't have to overdo ourselves with clones all the time. So that is just some of the upcoming projects. There's more things always on the horizon, but a lot of good stuff that I'm really excited about in the next little bit. So thank you so much for listening to this extremely long preamble, and let's jump right into the episode as I chat with Tom DeFalco and Pat Olliffe to talk about Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars Battleworld. Enjoy. Welcome back to the Comic Shenanigans podcast, both the legendary Tom DeFalco and, of course, my the good friend of the show, Pat Olliffe.
Hi, Adam.
Hi, Adam. Pat should have something.
I was just
gonna
say.
Yeah, come
I was
on.
just gonna say I don't get I'm not legendary, but maybe I'm not sure.
Legendary,
some kind of descriptive term. I don't know what that is.
Yeah, legendary just means you're old and unemployed.
Oh, hey, that could be me.
I feel like that should be your homework, Tom, for the end of the episode. Before we sign off, you'll have a special nickname for Pat.
Okay.
Uh-oh. Easy. That could go sideways kind of quickly.
That really could.
Well, thank you both for making the time today. So as we record this, actually next week is the release of the trade paperback version of the Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars Battleworld miniseries you guys recently did together, which is quite a name for a book. I'll have to say that. So I guess, Tom, let's go back a little bit. So you edited the original Secret Wars. I don't like to age people, but it is 40 years ago, right?
Sadly, it was 40 years ago.
So I'm curious, when you're working on a book like this that kind of revisits something that you did have a hand in and work on from the editorial perspective 40 years ago, like what was that process of them kind of coming to you to work on this at all? Like when did this kind of a conversation start? Well,
the editor, Mark Basil, got in touch with me, and he mentioned that they wanted to do an Untold Tales from the original Secret Wars. They said they wanted to do a sequel. I said, we did a sequel. It was called Secret Wars 2. I said, no, we want to do an Untold Tale. And I said, that story was pretty tight. I'd have to go back and reread the whole thing. Quite honestly, after I was done with Secret Wars, I don't think I ever looked at it again. I thought the whole idea was kind of goofy to do a sequel to something that was 40 years ago. That was actually older than Mark Basil, the editor.
Yes.
And so I reread the original Secret Wars, and I was surprised at how well that story actually, holds up. There's a lot of good stuff in that. Now looking back on it, from 40 years ago, the guys did a terrific job. Jim Shooter did a really good job scripting. Mike Zeck, Bob Layton, all the guys that pitched in, John Beatty. I mean, everybody did a great job on that thing. I look back on that and thought, well, hey, we did pretty good.
To go afield for a second, it's interesting, like right now, Marvel's doing facsimile editions of all the original Secret Wars issues. They're also doing the facsimile editions of a lot of your stuff that you did with Ron on Amazing Spider-Man. What is that like just for you as to see something like that? Like, obviously it's been recollected many times before, but there's something interesting about them doing as a facsimile edition. What are your thoughts on facsimile editions? Are they positive, negative, or neither here nor there?
This is Ron who? Ron can't play Zang.
I'm torn. On the one hand, I thought it was nice that they reprinted 252 because I could, grab a bunch of copies and then take them to conventions with me. This way I don't have to sign, little scraps of paper that people are going to throw out later on. But I can't for the life of me believe that these facsimiles are going to sell throughout the whole year. I'd like to believe they will, but I'm just amazed that they're doing that. I think.
Well, if you're in for a penny, in for a pound, right? Like if you're going to get a couple of them, you're going to get them all. So I guess that from that mentality.
I guess so, and I like a lot of the facsimiles. I just the other day I was in a comic book shop and I bought a facsimile of the first Green Lantern story from Showcase.
Oh wow, yeah.
Just because I know it's goofy stuff, but hey, I was a kid when that stuff came out and I loved it.
There's nothing wrong with goofy stuff, that's for sure.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm kind of thrilled about it. Part of me also thinks that, hey, if you're going to reprint the year's worth of Ron and my stuff, why don't you just run it out? Maybe do a new story for you.
Exactly.
Very true.
I'm tempted to call Marvel and ask them about that, but the trouble is they might actually say, yes, we'd like to do something, and then I'm going to actually have to do it.
So when you're talking with Mark and you're working on kind of the pitch for what becomes this miniseries, so I'm going to spoil for a little bit of this. So spoiler warning for those who haven't read it. But there is a bit of a surprise turn that I didn't expect in terms of you have these these unseen entities and they're talking about their primary kind of subject, and then we realize that it's not Spider-Man at all, and ends up being the symbiote that he's attached to. How early in your pitch process did that kind of come out? Because that's a great kind of turn, because as a reader, you don't really see that coming because you think it's all about Spider-Man.
Well, yeah, we did that deliberately. That was, pretty early in the pitch process. It was, you need to surprise the readers. You need to, you need to lead them down one path, and yet, surprise them by taking a twist and a turn. Although, because I'm an anal retentive structurist, we kind of set it up from the beginning.
Right.
If you go back and reread everything, the ending is told right there in the first issue.
Yeah.
I mean, but we did it. Hopefully we did it clever enough so that you didn't realize it till you got to the end, and then when you reread it, you go, oh, of course.
That's called storytelling craft.
Yeah. Yes,
So I promise I'm going to have questions for you, Pat, because it feels like I'm making it the Tom Show right now.
No, that's okay. I'm always happy to be part of the Tom Show.
But
That's how I spent a large part of my career.
this thing only worked because Pat did such a great job. It was supposed to be a full script, but as Pat can testify, I cheated a lot. Because, I think it's ridiculous to have a guy like Pat Olliffe handing him a full script, because whatever visuals I can come up with, his are so much better than mine.
Well, I always appreciate that, Tom.
That's, so do I, Pat.
So obviously you guys have worked together a lot in the past. So I'm curious, like at this point, like, do you get on the phone with each other and you're kind of chatting about the plot that you give him? Because, or how much leeway is there and how much back and forth is there or is there not?
Well, I don't know.
Go ahead, Pat.
Well, I mean, I was just going to say, there's not, at this point, there's not necessarily a ton of on the phone back and forth with Tom and I. I think we've worked together for long enough that we're very comfortable with how each other works. So, when I get a Tom DeFalco plot, disguised as a script, I immediately know what the story, I'm immediately comfortable with the storytelling. So, and I'm also comfortable with the fact that I understand that Tom trusts my storytelling choices, which I am very appreciative of. And Tom tells a great story. It's easy for me to tell a story visually, a Tom DeFalco story visually. So, in terms of the initial back and forth, we have this, initial beginning back and forth about the project, but then once it starts going, it's kind of like we just kind of fall into the same, kind of easy pattern that we've always fallen into, and it's a very easy working relationship.
Yeah, I often tell Pat and Ron that whatever I put in the script or the plot, consider these just suggestions, and that if you come up with better visuals, go with your visuals, because their visuals are much better than what I come up with.
So I want to get into the early part of the process. I'm curious, and I don't think I realized it till the fourth issue, reading what Mark had written at the end. But obviously, some of the choices on characters here are characters who had action figures from the original line, but weren't actually in the original story. Was that an idea that was presented more from Mark right from the beginning, or was that more of your idea, Tom?
That was presented by Mark, because I was unaware of the fact that some of these things had been, action figures, but hadn't appeared in the actual comics. Now, some of these figures came in, the second and third year of the Secret Wars.
Right, that's right.
But Mark, Mark was a very, I'm going to say hands-on editor. He got deeply involved, and I like an editor who cares about the project and gets involved in the project. And I'm thankful, because he had a lot of great suggestions.
Yeah, and he did. I mean, I thought that was one of the kind of the nice things that Mark really felt. He was obviously the editor of the project, but he also felt like he was a fan of the project. I don't mean to say that in any detrimental way, where he was a fan first. He was obviously the editor of the project. He had great input and great suggestions, but it felt like this was not. I never got the impression that this was not an important project to Mark or anybody else on the team. I mean, everybody was fully engaged and committed to what we were doing.
And that's the way I like it. I mean,
yeah, absolutely.
I want everybody committed 100% to it, because that's the only way I know how to work. You got,
right. And we can say the same thing for Drew. Drew Baumgartner was the assistant editor, and
he was fabulous.
Everybody on board was pulling in the same direction, which doesn't always happen. So it was nice that it happened on this project.
Now, I'm curious, Tom, given that you were the editor of the original series, I mean, at the time, obviously, the kind of the impetus for the series was the toy figure line. So I'm curious what that felt like at the time. I mean, there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, over the years written about it, more about Jim than I think your involvement, because obviously he's the one who was the head of the company and also writing it. But just in terms of, what that was like to have this series that was a big deal at the time. It was this maxi series, which was, again, not something that was being done at Marvel at the time. It was a new thing. And it's this tie into this, this other type of media. Was there a lot of extra stress on you as an editor at that time?
Well, not really, because, we saw this as kind of a toy book. Mm-hmm. I've said this before, but Jim Shooter wasn't the original writer for it. We had approached a number of people to script this book, but most of the guys weren't interested because they didn't want to be associated with a toy book. We had no idea this thing was going to sell the way it did, or have the longevity that it had, and it kind of caught us by surprise at how popular it was. I think Jim finally jumped into it, and I think he did a great job.
So let's talk about you guys working on this particular one. So as you mentioned before, and have mentioned before, this is kind of an unseen moment between two panels, which I love that was the decision that
I prefer to call it an untold tale, but that's just me.
You would.
Yes.
So we have an untold tale between the panels, which again is a lot of fun. Now, in terms of, and I always think of, and I think you've said this a lot, and this is why I think this way, Tom, but whenever I see it's written a Tom DeFalco adventure, I do think it's a hoo-ha story going in. And this felt like it really married your sensibilities quite well, because you like fun comic book action. And, this sounds like a negative, but I hope you take it as a positive, because the original one was a toy book, which was very much like, let's put these characters and kind of slam them together and have fun with them. This felt like a nice, extrapolation of that concept, using characters that were of the time. And it's always interesting to see you writing the Hobgoblin, because again, you're very well known for the Hobgoblin as well. So seeing you get to write that character in this version of the character is very interesting to be able to see again.
Well, thank you. I had a great time working on this project. Anytime I hear from Marvel, I always assume that this, the project I'm working on will be the last one I do. For a number of reasons. This was a real fun project. And if this one is the last one, it's a great way to go out, because I got to deal with a lot of characters that I enjoy, and just had a grand time for myself.
Besides Spider-Man, were there any characters that you really took a shine to that maybe you haven't had a chance to write a lot? Like, obviously, like Human Torch, you've written him a lot. Spider-Man, obviously, you've written a lot, but you haven't written a lot of Iceman or Falcon and these other characters. So did anyone surprise you as opposed to a voice you were able to kind of really sink your teeth into?
Well, I really enjoyed the Falcon. I thought he was, he was a lot of fun. They were all fun. I wish I had done a little bit more with Daredevil, because, I always liked Daredevil.
Now, when you're writing Absorbing Man, this was an interesting one, because obviously you've written him in Thor, I believe, and then I know you wrote him in Amazing Spider-Man, which would have been after the Clone Saga. But, this is something very archetypal about how you portray the character. But what I really want to get into with Absorbing Man is that knowing that you have an artist like Pat, who can really sink his teeth into the visuals, and that you can do so many things with Absorbing Man based on his powers and how that's expressed in the art. How was that a fun challenge to be able to think of different things he can be turning into and adapting to, or at times is it more stressful to be like, well, how do I best use this character? Because he's very specific.
It's a little of both. You're always trying to come up with something you've never seen before. Because because if you've seen it before, why bother? And the joy of dealing with Pat is I knew whatever ridiculous thing I threw at him, he'd be able to draw it.
Well, I did love and that was the fun thing about a lot of these characters, especially Absorbing Man, was that I've never really had a chance to draw him before. And, I'd get the script, and, Tom would make these great suggestions about how to use his powers, and, everything from, absorbing these rocks and become this giant figure. And then also, going from, the flame and then to the ice and then all that kind of, and especially the part where he's broken apart and then reforms. Obviously, this is just, if anyone's listening to this and hasn't read it, and there are spoilers here, that's on you. Everybody should have been have a long time ago. But yeah, he was such a great fun character to draw. And it was the same kind of thing that you had talked about in terms of, he's been drawn so many times by so many great artists. I mean, what can I bring to it? And realized that really my job was not really to figure out what can I bring to Absorbing Man. It was just how do I best draw this character in this story in this moment? Take yourself out of it and not worry about, what my take on the character is necessarily, but how do you handle this that tells the story to this in the most effective way? And then that kind of like reduces some of the angst about this. And you just kind of, you just draw the story, and then it just kind of makes it a lot easier.
A question I have for you, Pat, and we got into this a little bit, not the last episode you were on, but the one before it, because I think at the time there was just the first issue out, and we had talked about how you had never really had to do a black suit Spider-Man before, like in an actual comic before. And right. We were talking about what it was like to kind of approach that. And I don't know if I'd asked this question or not, but like when you're kind of modeling out the characters when they're doing something, like did you make a conscious decision that he was going to look a little different because of how the costume would look, like in terms of the lighting effects, etc.? Like did you just draw him like you would just draw him Spider-Man and then just put him in the black costume kind of as an overlay? Like how did you approach that? Did you find that you approached it any differently?
Oh, I mean, I think initially I wasn't quite sure about how to approach him. I had a general idea. But then once he starts interacting with other characters and backgrounds and interacting from a panel-to-panel storytelling kind of standpoint, then he really does become a very specific way to draw the black suit Spider-Man. You can't just draw him as, just Spider-Man that you always drew him and just throw some blacks on him. The suit really does require a certain design, there's a certain design challenge because of not only how the shapes of his costume, the shape of his arm or torso overlap each other, and it's black on black, and you have to kind of handle how the muscles all kind of work, and each form is separated. Same thing with backgrounds. Then it did become a kind of a design challenge, and it was a lot of fun to work with it. So I mean, I did look at a lot of Ron's stuff, and because he handled it so wonderfully. Yeah, it took a little bit of adjusting, but I think once you kind of got used to it and realized, how he was supposed to interact, not only with his backgrounds, but also him as a figure, it became certainly easier as the issues went on. So it was definitely more than just, I'm going to draw Spider-Man and throw some blacks on him. It was definitely a different take.
I'm curious about the eyes, because the eyes seemed like they were not necessarily all the eyes we're used to always seeing on the black costume Spider-Man. You definitely played with the eye shape a bit more.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if you could talk about like what kind of led to that decision to play with it a bit more, and what were you thinking as in terms of a design process when you do have the eyes not always being kind of as elongated as they sometimes are on the black costume, but almost being more just spherical. So I'm curious what led into some of those decisions.
Well, some of it was, like I said, looking at Ron's early designs. They just had a certain, like when I drew Until Tales of Spider-Man, I was using some of the influences of the time which was a more like a Todd McFarlane influence in a way, where his eyes were much larger. So this one specifically was kind of moving to something a little bit smaller. Like I said, looking kind of how Ron did the eyepieces. But then it became a situation where, because Spider-Man doesn't have, he's a full face mask. So you don't have a lot of his face, his eyes, his mouth to get across emotion. What you have to play with is the eyepieces. So I did play around with, if he's a little more surprised, they become a little bit more spherical. If they, or they narrow a little bit. I think that was kind of the main idea that I had, was to kind of make them a little bit smaller than, the kind of the Untold Tales Spider-Man version that I used to do. But also really take advantage of, that was really one of my few ways to convey emotion, and try to use it that way. Just kind of play with the eye pieces and eye size to get across whatever he was feeling in the moment.
Now I'm curious as well, like you have some shots, like before we get the bigger reveal about the symbiote, but in terms of the symbiote starting to do stuff, like it replaces the web sling with a bit of its own kind of symbiote. Right. It's interesting because it felt like you were really making it feel like of the time period, because you weren't using the future symbiote influences in the ways that people have used the symbiote in terms of the visuals in a more modern context, but you were using more what would have been happening in 1984 in terms of how they would have designed it at that time. And I'm guessing that was a very conscious decision.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had the original Secret Wars in front of me. I mean, John's work was in front of me, and I don't remember necessarily and like an edict from Mark that we had to really be in line with the original story. Clearly, I think Mark's input would lead you to believe that that's kind of what the direction he was looking for, which I was totally fine with. I think that was kind of what I was thinking as well. So I really took my cues from how he was portrayed in the original series. So I kind of limited myself to what John was doing and to that specific look.
In the fourth issue in particular, like when you again have that kind of big reveal that the symbiote kind of takes control, it was interesting because it did feel more almost like a shadow monster, like it almost looked something that the Shadow Thief would have used. But it again did feel very of the time and of that initial interpretation. So it was just interesting to see it, because again, you don't go with the tongue, because obviously that's a much later, larger introduction. So it's interesting to kind of see the character again feeling very of the time, which again makes this even more of a untold story, because it feels very of the time.
Yeah, and I think that was partly, like I said, I don't remember specifically Mark saying we don't want the elongated tongue or any of that kind of thing. That might have been a note, but I don't remember it being that way. But it was clear through the entire process of the series that was where we were headed. That was the influence we were using. We were going to try to make it truly an Untold Tales story of the time, and everybody was kind of on board with that. So when that scene came up, and as it was described in Tom's script, there was I was never a thought of mine that I wanted to make it a more modern influence. I wanted to make sure that it was specifically influenced by that time period.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the time period, and I have to give my hat off to Tom for this. It was a small thing, but like when you have Hobgoblin show up and Spider-Man's like, "You're dead," because he would have been just, they just thought he died. Like, I love, it's a little touch, but if you knew the continuity of the time and when this story would have taken place and when Spider-Man would have disappeared from his own book, it was very fresh. So I like those smaller details, which you don't have to add them, but they add a lot to the overall kind of world and the context of the story, and it makes it feel more lived in. So just as a fan, I appreciated that, Tom.
Well, I'm sure you're the only fan that actually, caught that.
Maybe.
I don't know. I think people that were picking up this story also, there were plenty of people that remembered the original, and we're happy to see little nods like that.
No, that's what we're supposed to do.
Absolutely.
So, Tom, one thing I had talked about with Pat before, talking about the first issue, is that I've always loved the visual of Spider-Man in the sling, and I always think of Ron Friends' version of that. And so when I was really thinking about it, I'm like, what is it about Tom that keeps putting Spider-Man in the sling?
I like to beat up my heroes. What can I tell you? Make life a little bit more difficult for them.
And for the penciler, for the artist too, because now we only got the guy with one arm.
Yeah, and then he has to drag the Human Torch with him.
Right, exactly.
When you're writing Human Torch, Tom, because I'm curious as well, because you do such a great job of making sure it kind of fits in the continuity. You're a continuity guy. You remember how these things are supposed to work. So, this is a Johnny from before you would have written your run with Paul. So I'm just curious what it was like for you to kind of get in the mindset of this version of Human Torch at this specific period of time.
Well, whenever I think of Johnny, I think of a guy I know who... every time he walked into the room, he was waiting for the cameras, the flash bulbs to start popping because, he knew he was the center of attention at all times. And that's basically what I think of Johnny. And the younger Johnny was totally, egocentric, ego-driven. And, I just think of my old buddy.
It's funny you say that because I think of I think the first Human Torch I'd ever really read was yours in your run with Paul Ryan. And so it's funny because I always thought that you really matured him up in a natural way. Like he felt like he had grown up. And then unfortunately it felt like in the last 20 years he's progressed further. But there's just something about the natural evolution of the character that you really built in when you were writing Fantastic Four. Like the characters really did feel like they grew up and they learned things through your stories. So I just, again, as a fan, want to thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I tried to do the best I could.
So I want to ask about, this is for both of you actually, what was it like to work with a character like Baron Zemo? First you, Tom, in terms of writing the character, because at this time, I'm trying to remember the chronology. I guess this would have been before, his kind of defining storyline, which would have been the Under Siege at the Avengers Mansion. So this is an earlier version of that character. So how did you kind of get into his purple head sock?
Well, I just looked at him and thought, who do I know who's like Baron Zemo?
Uh-oh.
And, and I figured, here's a guy who, he thinks he's smarter than everybody else. And most of the time he is smarter than everybody else. And he's always planning ahead. And he's kind of, he's playing chess and he's playing chess, 3 or 4 moves ahead of everybody else. So I figured whenever I'm dealing with characters that are much smarter than I am, I was figure out the end first and then work backwards.
What I liked about your take on the Baron, especially, and this is something that I think is often forgotten, is just how smart he is, not just as a tactical person or as a leading a team, but also from a technical perspective. His dad obviously created Adhesive X, like there's that lineage there. So I did like you kind of leaned into that version of his character, which I do think is often forgotten.
The character is the character. I'm one for consistency, not so much for continuity, but consistency. I try to analyze what the character has always been and work from there.
Now, Pat, I was especially enamored with your portrayal of the good Baron, or the not so good Baron, as the case may be. There's just something about a lot of your close-ups on his face in terms of the framing of that tiara, I guess, for lack of a better word, that kind of goes around his face. There's just something about how you really nailed the emotion somehow in a character that is really giving you none. I found it really really fascinating. And so I'm curious what it was like for you to draw this character.
Well, it's the first time I've ever drawn him, so it's always exciting to get a chance to draw, a classic character like that for the first time. But his imperious nature was just that kind of informed how I decided how I handled the drawing of the character. I mean, when we first see him, I had him kind of standing with 1 foot up and his hand kind of outstretched, kind of pontificating to Absorbing Man and the Constrictor, and then it became kind of and that little headband that he wore actually helped a little bit, because it seemed for each close-up, it almost seemed natural for a character with that ego that his head should always be tilted up a little bit, where he's kind of looking down on his nose at everybody. So that little kind of head tilt is harder to do when you have no facial features, when you basically just have eyes. And so his little head piece allowed helped me a little bit to indicate that his head was kind of tilted up a little bit. So if you go through the story, most of his close-ups are always with his head tilted up, kind of looking down on whoever he's speaking to. So, that was super fun.
A question I have about Zemo, and this is such a silly question, but there's just something about how you made the fur on his shoulders look like, again, this sounds ridiculous, but I find that's a tough thing to get right.
Yes.
And so I'm curious, how do you make it look like that? Like, it's such an amateurish question, but I'm actually curious, like, how do you make something look like it's fur?
Well, I mean, it's just a matter of.
These are the hard-hitting questions, Pat.
What's that?
These are the hard-hitting questions.
No, yeah, that's what I've come to expect, Adam. So I'm so no, it's just that it's just that kind of like little there's little multiple lines that kind of surround the form and just kind of make it look like fur. Fortunately, my inker didn't screw it up too much, which so the inker obviously was me. So yeah, it's just a little technique where you just kind of rough up the edges, and then it ends up making like fur. And so, and I will take a moment to give a shout out to John Cleese, who colored the books. He was phenomenal. I mean, part of the reason the books look as good as they do is because of John's work. Just an absolutely beautiful job that John did. And so when you have things like that have a little bit of a texture to them, it's nice to know that the colorist kind of follows your lead and is able to kind of play it up as well. So, hats off to John for doing such a great job on the issue, and to Joe Caramana as our letterer as well.
So a question about your work with Cleese, because there's a specific thing that as a recurring theme, you have the little kind of boxes on the different characters to kind of show, I guess, what they're feeling at that moment, or what's kind of being categorized by these other beings from beyond.
Yes.
I'm curious, what kind of design work did you think of to try and come up with something that would make sense for this? And Tom, did you have something else in mind when you first kind of thought of it, or what was the conversation between you like? Because that's a very specific choice, and it obviously needs to be, visually conveyed and very succinctly. So I'm curious what that was like.
Well, we used the discs that appeared with the toys.
Yeah.
I don't think I realized that. That's funny.
Yeah, that was it. We had we very specifically used the shields that were part of the toy line to indicate the different characters. So that was really specifically referenced, and that was something certainly that Mark wanted to have happen as well.
I had no idea about that, so my apologies for not knowing that. But that is an excellent detail, man.
There you go.
See, we have a lot of Easter eggs in this thing. Far too many.
So this is a question for Pat. I'm curious. I mean, obviously, as we talked about before, you're portraying a specific earlier version of the Hobgoblin, who at this point in his chronology had mainly been just a JR character, but obviously then just after where this chronology would have taken place, then Ron becomes the kind of the regular penciler on the Hobgoblin for a while. So how did you have to kind of decide the exact kind of visual sense you wanted to go to? Because it did feel more of a Ron influence than a JR influence. So I'm curious if that was more of a cognizant choice, or it was just kind of that's just the way it looks under you.
We keep mentioning this Ron guy. I got to figure out who this is. But no, it was
nobody
important.
Specific.
What's that?
He's nobody important. Forget about
him. I'm sure he will hear this and have a comment. So I think at that point, I mean, I did look at a lot of Ron's stuff. I mean, all kidding aside, I mean, Ron's, he's one of the best artists to ever work in this business. So, so getting a chance to work on some of these characters, you look for different influences and who designed these characters and who worked on these characters. So I did look to Ron for inspiration and how he handled the characters and the character design. But really the overarching kind of edict about how to handle these characters was time specific. Was what did they look like in that time period that they would have been plucked out of and put into this situation. So it was more that, it was more just finding, okay, what did he look like in this moment? And then I just drew him as best that I could. I mean, that's just kind of how it worked.
Now, this is a question for Tom about when you're writing the Hobgoblin. I mean, obviously nowadays, we know he was Roderick Kingsley, but obviously at the time you were writing him, he wasn't, and you had your own idea of who that was going to be. Did you, in your mind, write him as who you thought he would have been? Or were you retroactively adding in the Roderick Kingsleyness to your interpretation of the Hobgoblin here? Or did I think more about that question than you probably did?
I think you might have thought more about it than I did, because I basically thought of the way Roger Stern, whenever I wrote the Hobgoblin, I always had Roger Stern whispering in my ear, because I'm a big Roger Stern geek. He created the Hobgoblin. I loved the way he handled the character, and I was just doing my best to imitate Roger Stern's version of the character. I wasn't thinking of Kingsley. I wasn't thinking of the character that I thought the Hobgoblin was. I was just thinking of Raj, and I do want to say that Pat did a fabulous job on the Hobgoblin. Some of those scenes. There's this one scene where he's just looking at Zemo, which is just fabulous. I remember looking at that page thinking, this one page is worth the price of admission alone.
Well, I appreciate it. Your check's in the mail.
It's interesting that Tom says that, though, because I was thinking that as well, that you do some really great kind of ominous shots of the Hobgoblin kind of watching Zemo. And it did feel like one of those moments where, and maybe I like most of this, I'm probably reading too much into it. But it did feel like it was a more like if someone else had inked it, it may not have worked as well, because there's just something about once you know exactly what you want from it and you are the one adding in the inks as well, I think you're able to achieve that kind of that menace, that look in the shadows that I don't know. I mean, I'm sure a lot of inkers can do it, but there's just something about validating your expression in your mind of what you want this to look like. And I think inking it yourself allowed you to kind of control that narrative in a different way, and probably is what makes that work as well.
Well, I appreciate that. And I think that is true. I mean, I've been very, very fortunate to work with a lot of really just amazing inkers. I mean, everybody from Tom Palmer, Al Williamson, Tom Nguyen. I'm going to leave a bunch of guys out if I start this list. But yeah, there is something different when you ink it yourself, because then what you kind of originally had in mind has a more direct representation on the page. And in terms of the Hobgoblin scenes where he is, watching Zemo, that comes from the story. I mean, that's just, the story required that kind of reaction shot, that kind of mood, that kind of intent, and really more often than not, most of the choices that most comics artists make, or at least the ones that I'm a fan of, those choices are all story driven. So yes, you'd love to have these kind of shots where you get to evoke a certain emotion or have a big action scene or whatever. But the beginning of the process is always story first. So that's what that scene required, and I try not to screw it up.
No, something I really want to mention, because it was just so well done by you, Pat, was, and Tom did a great job scripting it as well, is at near the end of the 4th issue, when you have that big moment where Spider-Man's going to sacrifice himself and destroy that machine.
Yep.
You start with 4 panels first, and you're slowly kind of getting closer and closer to kind of ratchet up the tension. I'm assuming that obviously was the idea there, but then when you actually have that moment of him destroying the machine, it did have the vibes of a Ditko throwing throwing the wreckage off. I'm imagining that would have been relatively, purposeful.
I don't think it was purposeful in the sense that I wanted to specifically evoke that Ditko scene, but that seemed to me such a quintessential Spider-Man scene. Not only from a character standpoint, because Tom did such a great job writing it, that whole the self-sacrifice thing. I mean, it was just so purely a Spider-Man moment that, pulling the camera in as the emotion increases, that just seemed to give a natural progression. And then, of course, like you said, when he breaks apart the machine, I didn't necessarily specifically think I want to do a Ditko thing there, but because it is such a classic kind of quintessential Spider-Man moment, and all the Ditko I've looked at over the course of my career, it's hard not to draw on that in some fashion.
It is interesting. I think Khalees adds a sense of kind of Kirby energy crackle to it, right? Because in terms of the coloring effects, which really kind of adds to the moment.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah. John did just a fantastic job with that scene. Absolutely.
John understands that the purpose of the color is to help tell the story, which some modern colorists don't get that.
Right.
That they are storytellers too. We all work to get. One of the things I love about comics is it's a team sport where we're all working together for one purpose, which is to tell a story.
Absolutely.
Excellent. A character that I really liked, again, by you, Pat, was your take on, and I've mentioned this before, but was Human Torch. There's something really special about it in terms of how you draw the physicality of the character, and then obviously Khalees has to add the kind of coloring effects. But I think we talked before specific about that first issue, but even moving from there, there's just something about how you add the physicality of what he looks like flying through the air. I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to what influences you were drawing from to try to make that work, and how important the inks were there as well.
Sure. Well, like I said, my inker wasn't a complete loser, so that helped. But I think we talked before was that there's a lot of different kind of versions of the Human Torch. So I specifically pulled from the Human Torch version from that era, the way John kind of was drawing him. And that was my starting point, because I wanted to make sure it was kind of time specific, which was fine, because that's a version of the Human Torch that I really love. So getting a chance to draw him was a lot of fun. It's one of my favorite characters. I haven't had a lot of chance to draw him before, and getting a chance to draw him in a Spider-Man story where you get to see the two of them interact was a lot of fun. But Human Torch is one of those characters that, as much fun as I had drawing him, trying to get the flame kind of to follow the contours of his body as he was flying and all that kind of stuff. Human Torch is one of those characters, when you draw him in black and white, you kind of say, oh yeah, that's the Human Torch, but it doesn't have the impact until you see the colors. And then when you see it colored, it's like, oh my God, that's the Human Torch. And John did a fantastic job with kind of interspersing kind of the white and the bright, the more intense yellows and the reds, to really make it look like that he was on fire, like the flames were kind of licking around and flowing off of his body, and so it was just, I just absolutely loved drawing that character. Absolutely loved drawing that character. He was probably one of my favorites in the series. But he is one of those characters that really doesn't come alive until he's got the colors on him.
Did you feel like you tackled him differently than you had done in Untold Tales?
Yeah, I mean, I think because at the time, when I drew him in Untold Tales of Spider-Man, I only had a chance to draw him in one issue, and that was specific to the time as well. So there was less defining of his musculature, and the way the flames kind of worked on his body was different than it would have been at the time that we were pulling from in Untold Tales of Spider-Man. So more of those kind of like curvy lines on his body, a specific way to handle the flames. So yeah, it was certainly different, just primarily because, again, it wasn't necessarily in Untold Tales of Spider-Man in Secret Wars Battleworld. It wasn't in both instances me deciding to draw the Human Torch the way Pat Olliffe wants to draw a Human Torch. It was more drawing the Human Torch based on where he was at a specific time period, both in Untold Tales of Spider-Man and in this project as well.
Khalees does do this interesting effect in the third issue where you're starting to have Johnny flame on, but he's not quite there yet, but he's starting to turn the red. And it did remind me of when Johnny actually had a red FF costume. Kind of an interesting moment there.
That was one of my favorite. I loved back when Buscema. Yeah, I loved that red and yellow look. That was so much. I love that.
So it was an interesting take on it to kind of look like that. Back to you, Tom. A character who doesn't unfortunately get too much to do, but there's just so many other much bigger personalities, was the Constrictor. But he does get a moment or two to shine in the fourth issue. What was your interpretation of the Constrictor?
This is the first time I've dealt with that character. So I just did my best on him. I read up on him and studied the kind of guy he was supposed to be. Basically somebody who, he used to be a member of S.H.I.E.L.D. and, he was a true believer who lost his faith. I can identify with a character like that.
It was an interesting touch too, because it was interesting to keep leaning on the fact that, like, he's a mercenary at the end of the day. He wants to get paid. Like,
right.
I'll do what you want, Zemo, as long as my usual rates apply. Like, there's this. It's nice to have, again, a variety of different villains who do things for very different reasons. And his is more, if you pay me, I'll do it, which is, in some ways refreshing. It's not something bigger than that. It can sometimes be that simple.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the last questions, and I promise I'll let you both gentlemen go in just a moment. In the last issue, right before you get to as I said, that big climactic moment where Spider-Man destroys the machine and is ready to sacrifice himself, you have this great panel where he has frozen everyone kind of in their tracks, and so Spider-Man's in the far background, and then all the other villains and heroes who are fighting or trying to get him are kind of more in the foreground, but we're behind them. I'm curious what it was like to kind of lay out that page, because it looks technically difficult.
Well, yeah, it was, because you want to see all the characters frozen. You wanted to see all those kind of like zombie characters unconscious, and Spider-Man was obviously the focus of the panel in terms of his reaction, but the characters all being frozen needed to be in the foreground. So it was kind of challenging. And then how do you draw them, showing them in action one moment and then frozen in the next moment? So that was a little bit of a challenge in terms of, if you look at the panel, everybody is frozen in some kind of action pose, even Falcon in the air. But the Human Torch, he's also in the air, but all his flames are like wicking upward so that he is frozen in motion. He's not in motion because they're not trailing behind him. He's frozen, so the flames lick upward. The same thing with the absorbing man. He's he's got his body turned as he was swinging his wrecking ball, but the wrecking ball is now hanging down by his side because that's not in motion. The figures are frozen, but their weapons are not. So that was kind of what I was hoping to get across to help show that they are frozen. So I mean, the readers will have to decide if I pulled that off or not.
It's funny, we've talked so much, Pat, in the past about how you started to do the visuals differently once you were used to guided view, obviously working with Chuck on the Comixology originals. So that had become a kind of a new tool in your toolbox. It's interesting to look at the page before where you have Spider-Man in the foreground now, and it's his perspective. And then now the next panel is obviously having flipped it, and you've had minor progression on some of the characters' kind of action arcs, as you said, like the wrecking ball is now at a slightly different angle. So you can see, like, I would imagine you did the foreground shot first, and then you did the kind of the behind them shot second, or which one kind of came naturally first?
I don't really think there was the best way to describe it is there really wasn't a first or second. I mean, it was a kind of a cohesive kind of a whole. Once once I knew the camera was going to move from, basically on the previous page it was behind Spider-Man. And then of course the next, that page, it had to be the focus on Spider-Man. That seemed to be a natural progression of how to lay out the page. So once that kind of decision was made, the actual laying out of foreground, background characters, it all kind of happened at the same time. It all kind of comes together as one unit.
Tom, there's something very special about comic books in terms of the sound effects, which is very unique to comics compared to kind of most other mediums. What do you take a specific relish in developing different sound effects to be used? Because there's a lot throughout this series that are a lot of fun. I'm just curious what kind of thought process that goes into them. Because again, it really, if there's much, maybe there isn't, but it definitely helps to accentuate that idea of, as we said before, the hoo-ha action. There's just something about the larger than life kind of fun of comics that when you see those sound effects, it drives home that sense of fun and excitement that, if you don't have those, you're kind of losing something. You're losing some sort of engagement with the reader. So I'm curious how you approach them.
I approach them, I spend a lot of time shouting at my computer, making strange sounds, and then trying to figure out how to spell those sounds. And I can tell you that there have been occasions where my wife has come in and said, "Are you all right?" There are so many things that are fun about writing comics that, I just, try to dive into the fun and grab it with both hands and hang on for dear life. Because, like I say, I don't know how many more comics I will be, have the privilege of writing, I love this medium. I just love this medium. I love the team sport. I love the opportunity to work with guys like Pat and John and Mark Bazzo and Drew and and even that Ron Friends guy. It's
Friends. That's it. Ron Friends. I knew
Ron Friends. Yes. Somewhere. It is. Just an incredible pleasure and an incredible honor, and I'm just so thankful that I have had the chance to do it for over 50 years now.
What I want to ask as well is, it felt like you hadn't done, or maybe they just hadn't asked you recently to do a longer form story in a Marvel book. You've done a lot of the 10 pagers, which I've always, when I ever see them, I think Tom is so good at 10-page stories because they're so hard to do, and to have a beginning, middle, and end in such a short period. What is it about you that you're able to tackle that so well?
Natural talent.
I don't know. I do 5-page stories for Archie Comics, here and there. It's just the craft. it's just the craft. You find out how many pages you have, and then you construct accordingly.
You just seem to be exceptionally good at it, is my point, I guess,
Well,
because a lot
I
of
agree.
people can write stories, but to be able to be as succinct and get so much across in such a relatively limited page space really is an art. And I'm noticing it more and more. And so I'm more and more thankful when you do one of these, 10 pagers. Obviously, you've done a bunch with Ron Friends in the last couple of years, or I guess maybe a few years now. But, they're always special, and they get a lot in there. And I forget that it's only 10 pages because of how much you're able to pack in, that some modern writers don't even pack in full 20 pages with that.
Well,
Are you paying him for this, Tom?
I really shouldn't I? I don't know what to say about that. I think that whatever story you're doing should be a complete unit of entertainment. If it's a 20-page story, if it's a 10-page story, it's a 5-page story. And, I just try my best. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. I really enjoy doing the 4-issue limited series because it's been a while since I've had a chance to do something like that for Marvel. Because basically they just drag me out when they have an anniversary issue, or they just have a limited number of pages to fill.
They drag you out, blow the dust off, and say, "Here, write this stuff."
Yeah, I remember one time Brevoort said, "Yes, we need you for a 5-page anniversary story," and I said, "You need me because I'm the only guy you know who can write a 5-page story."
One thing I haven't asked you about, Tom, actually, and it happened since the last time, I think the last time you were on my show, we did a deep dive with Ron Friends into A Next, which is always a book that meant a lot to me when I was younger. I just love that book, and I've always told Ron how much I loved it. So we did a complete deep dive into those 12 issues, of which you joined us for issues 7 to 12. In that time since that story, obviously, you guys did another Avengers Next or A Next story through, I guess, the Infinity Comics. I'm curious what that was like for you. I've talked with Ron about it, but what was it like to kind of be able to revisit those characters, but not just revisit those characters, but revisit an adventure, kind of like here, where it's an untold adventure, although one that you referenced in the first issue way back when anyway. What was it like to kind of be able to go back to that nugget?
It was a lot of fun, and it was also getting back into the research and trying to figure out what were where were their heads at this time. I love all these characters. J2 has a special place in my heart because he's his book was such an odd book. And I know this will sound weird, but when I approach these characters, and any of my writing, I approach them as if these are real people, and I do my best to make them seem like real people. And one of the things that I've always been proud of is that when people would, back in the day when they would write letters about the book and the characters, they would be talking about the characters and not about me or my style or the artist or and I always thought that when we're doing our job as creative people, we should be invisible. It should just be, the characters should just be so real that they whisk the people off into the stories. And I know that's kind of ridiculous. We're talking about comic book characters, but yet, this is what I firmly believe in. This, and sometimes I read some modern comics, and it almost looks like the creative people are making fun of the characters.
Right.
And I know I'm an old fart, but I kind of resent that. If I'm paying my money, I want to be whisked into a story. You know,
Well, it's that kind of connection too, that to the reader, and that's what keeps them coming back. I mean, that's what keeps it from becoming, a one and done event where you have something that just kind of happens in front of you, but you don't have an emotional connection to it, so it's easy to then kind of fall away from it. But that kind of idea that, that kind of connection that you form with the reader, that's what created this whole industry. I mean, that's what keeps people coming back. That's what keeps people connected to the characters. I mean, I think that's the most important thing that we do.
Yeah,
So-
and I wish more modern comics would do that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So a question, Tom. So this is a field and like kind of far afield from what we're actually talking about in terms of the Secret Wars mini. But recently, I've been doing kind of a Book of the Month club, to kind of going back on the Clone Saga stuff, just because it was something I enjoyed at the time, and it always was interesting to me that you were the one who ends up getting tasked with killing off Dr. Octopus. But then the minute the Clone Saga is over, you bring him back pretty fast. And to be honest, I always appreciated the way you brought him back, because you didn't try to say, oh, he wasn't dead. Like, he was dead. Now we're living in the Marvel Universe. There's mystical ceremonies all the time. Let's bring him back. So I always appreciated that. But it did feel like, like that was something you wanted to undo the first chance you could. Is that an accurate read on how you felt?
That is an accurate read. I was in the meeting where they decided that to prove that Kane's such a tough guy, he's going to kill Dr. Octopus, and I've always resented that kind of story. And you see it again and again. Oh, we're going to bring in a new villain. We're going to prove he's really tough by killing off some other character. We had that meeting, and I was a lone voice in the wilderness, keep saying we shouldn't do it, we shouldn't do it, we shouldn't do it, and I was outvoted. The editor decided we're going to do it, okay. And then as they're lining up the stories, it happened to fall in my issue. And I said, do I have to be the one to do this? And they said, yep. You're the guy. And I had to turn in the plot like 3 or 4 times, because every time I turned in the plot, Danny Fingeroth looked at it and he said, I can see how you get Dr. Octopus out of this. And I had to conclusively kill him, and which I did, but even as I did it, I knew how I was going to get him out of it.
Speaking of how you brought him back out of it, I'm curious, and they've never, I think, been used since, but I always liked them, the True Believers, an offshoot of the Hand.
Right.
What kind of led to their creation?
They were supposed to, yeah.
Maybe you just weren't allowed to use the Hand at the time? Like, I don't know.
No, in the plot, they were supposed to be the Hand, but the artist decided to draw something brand new. And we were so late that we couldn't get it all redrawn. So we said, okay, this is an offshoot of the Hand. And
it always felt like you leaned into it pretty well then.
Well, I was always doing the best I could with the time I had available.
Yeah, because they weren't even wearing red, like they were wearing green, and it was a completely different design aesthetic.
Yep. The Green Ninjas, love them.
I promise I'll let you go in just a moment. Because I'm in this era, and that is one of my favorite eras of Amazing Spider-Man, just because that was the era when I first started buying it on a regular basis. You wrote a fantastic Electro story at that time with Joe Bennett, where you really kind of amped up the threat level in a character like Electro. What was that? Was that important to you to try and kind of restore the dignity to the character? Because it felt like in the early 90s, they had tried to kind of, do a light the night kind of storyline, but he was kind of sad and pathetic afterwards. But then you kind of really rehabilitated the Electro character. Was that a very specific directive for you, that you wanted to rehab this character that you liked?
Well, I've always had the attitude there are no bad characters. There's just, bad versions of them. And I thought,
Very politically correct.
let's, this is a pretty powerful character. So let's give him his moment really to shine. So, again, I was trying to do my best by, a Ditko character.
Well, I think you succeeded very well. Again, it was I always really enjoyed that story. You added a lot of extra layers to a character like Electro, who typically was not given such care and love. So I always appreciated it as a reader.
All right. Thank you very much.
I'm doing as much as I can to make you blush.
Well, listen,
Which is a problem on an audio interview.
Yes. I keep trying to, I keep trying to get things right. And give me a couple more years and maybe I will.
Well, guys, thank you so much for taking the time to come and talk with me about, many things, but obviously the main thing was Marvel Superheroes Secret Wars Battleworld, which is, again, quite the title. It comes out in trade paperback form. This comes out on, I think, the 4th of May. So I think May 7th is when that trade paperback comes out. So if people haven't already read it, even though we spoiled the crap out of it, you definitely should pick it up. It's a fantastic read. It's a lot of fun. It sits nicely next to Secret Wars 1. Would you do another kind of version of this when they do the 40th anniversary of Secret Wars 2?
Yes, if they, they have to prop my hand up, and I don't even know what I would be drawing with at that point. So,
I think he means next year is Secret Wars 2.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. Well,
I got my timeline confused. There's so many timelines; it's all so confusing. If you look at that story, there is a definite sequel to be had. But I'm figuring, that they probably won't get around to it for 40 years, and it won't be my problem when they do get around to it. Well, if they ever want to do it anytime before either of us have kicked the bucket, I am all in.
Okay, sounds good.
You heard it here, folks. They're going to.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, again, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure talking to both of you, and thank you so much for all of your time today.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much. It was great. Thank you.
Yeah.